Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. As you know, we are discussing political parties, and we're talking about the behavior of political parties and why they do what they do. So far, we've talked about the structure of parties, their objectives. We've talked about the ways that they function and how they structure the relationship between voters and democratic institutions. And we've talked a lot about their behavior and why they make the kinds of appeals they make, what sorts of linkage strategies they use when they try to build support. We've talked about how parties have to adapt their linkage strategy and often their constituency in response to complex social changes, especially in new democracies in developing countries where parties can easily miscalculate and suffer a very catastrophic fate, losing elections, losing power, and even losing democracy, as we saw in the case of Senegal. Parties matter a great deal. And I have to say that one of the most unsatisfying parts of talking about politics and teaching about politics is sort of falling back on this uncomfortable feeling that we really can't live with parties, but we can't live without them. We've seen examples of political systems that function without parties. Nunavut, for example, has a system without parties. But in most cases, and at a large scale, parties are necessary because they constrain elites and because they function to sort of disperse power and kind of settle elite conflicts. And they give elites an incentive to respond to voters, most importantly. And really, at the end of the day, that's what it's about, voters. And if constraining elites and structuring politics is necessary to connect voters to democratic institutions, then parties have an important role to play. But there are some important questions, about whether and to what degree parties do actually represent and respond to voters. You see, one of the foremost assumptions and premises of democratic theory is that as voters, we elect representatives to stand in for us and that they will, in turn, effectively represent us and create policy with our interests in mind, pursue our objectives, our interests. After all, we elected them and they depend on us. And so, embedded in the very idea of democracy is that parties will represent voters once parties get in power. But this is an assumption that we've too often made without examining. And as you'll see, and maybe as you've begun to notice already from the reading, there are questions about whether parties effectively represent voters and whether they're responding to voters or market signals, whether voters matter more under some circumstances and whether market signals matter more under some circumstances. And as you can imagine, this all matters a great deal because economies are only getting more integrated, generally speaking, and globalization is a real thing. And so, inevitably, we have to ask questions about what sorts of motivations and factors lead politicians to do what they do and why they're responding the way they are. And so, what we're going to do today is we're going to begin this new unit on party responsiveness and, in particular, the behavior of parties when they get in power and what we know about really how governments respond or don't respond to different groups. And the key question for us is really a question about accountability and about responsiveness as a factor in accountability. If democratic institutions are going to be accountable, if parties are going to be accountable, well, they need to be responding to our preferences. So we're going to be engaging with this question today, and we're going to take this on in a variety of ways. I want to engage with you, but I also have some different content that we'll consider. And I think that the main objective for us is to just try to have a very loose and open conversation. My objective today is a little bit different than what I typically set out to do. I want to sort of have a conversation throughout today. And I want this to be like a kind of discussion based lecture. Normally, I'll give a lecture and then I will kind of incorporate and we'll have that larger discussion at the end. But I think that the best way for us to do this today is to have more of an open dialogue. And so I want you to focus on things like strengthening or exercising your speaking skills or thinking about or responding to questions. And then more generally, just thinking about democracy in your understanding of democracy, and then how parties fit into that, and then what we expect from parties in terms of responsiveness and accountability. So we're going to launch this by just asking a simple question. And I think that the best way to begin is just to see what your sort of understanding or your knowledge or your idea is on this question of who parties are responding to and what's really motivating them and what makes them tick or what moves them, so to speak. And so I'm going to launch a poll and just let me know what you think. Three of you still have yet to vote. So if you have yet to vote, please join us and vote. Just another moment and then we will move along. So just if you're still waiting, just go ahead and punch in your vote. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. As you can see, 9 of you, or 31% of you, said that public opinion, for the most part, motivates parties. 20 of you, or 69% of you who voted, most of you voted, said that market actors or business actors mainly motivate parties. And this is an interesting result. But before I have a comment, can someone talk to us a little bit about why they chose either public opinion or market actors? So who chose public opinion? Ishan, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, so I chose public opinion because I think at the end of the day, what you're getting elected by the constituents, and therefore public opinion is fundamental to the policies that you take as a legislator or a member of whatever legislative body that you're in. Regardless of how the market influences you, you can't get away with doing something that's directly against the your public constituency and expect to have a better chance of retaining office.
I think there's a lot here, so I want to restrain myself and encourage anyone to piggyback or to offer a different perspective. Um, can we hear from someone else?
Yeah, I can share. I chose market actors. I totally agree with what Ishan said about public opinion. I was kind of like debating. Um, but it feels like to me, businesses and like corporations and market actors, um, what they do really affects the economy and really affects, the market, obviously. And they can kind of throw their weight around and, use their influence. Um, Two parties. So that's why I think that market actors have more influence than public opinion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Edna. Let's hear from some other folks.
I think I also chose market actors, and I think one of the reasons why I chose that is because we see the majority of the time whenever it comes to parties and people that are kind of like in a seat or somewhere in Congress or anything like that, they usually go where the money is because the money is gonna help them be elected more. For example, there's like PACs and there's like ways that they get funding for their elections or for their re-elections, and sometimes for them it's a greater cost not to go with the market actors and then go for the public opinion.
See, now this is really interesting. What Alondra highlights is that there's sort of a difference between like campaigning and then governing. Like when you govern, you're making policy and you're creating law. But when you're campaigning, you have to send signals and respond in certain ways to constituents and to the people who, like Ishan said, really at the end of the day are electing you or not. But here's the critical point, and here's the rest of the story that I think Ishan might miss. And as Edna points out, you really need, in many cases, those private resources made available to you by the private actors and the business actors in order to campaign effectively enough to get elected, right? So maybe it's not a fair question. Maybe there's a difference between campaigns and governing, and maybe parties are sophisticated and nuanced. It's possible that they're campaigning very effectively and connecting very effectively with voters, and yet governing in a way that also produces large enough dividends for specific market actors that they then in turn obtain enough private financing to campaign effectively enough to get reelected. Now I'm just spitballing here. It's just an idea. Of course, what we're discussing sort of implies that private financing is how campaigns are financed. And that's the norm in the United States. It's not the norm everywhere. Many places, campaigns and elections are public affairs and they have very tight limits on spending, and it's a very different ballgame. But here in the United States, there are some very different incentives. Campaigning rewards different behaviors than does governing. And this is another explanation of or for why some parties are better at campaigning and other parties are better at governing. And so I think that everything that we've talked about so far is on point. I just think that the picture is more complex than even the question itself let on. And the reading that we did for this week also highlights that this is quite complex, in that to a certain degree it matters, you know, whether the domestic economy is sheltered or protected from the international economy and the business cycle and global recessions, in a variety of exogenous factors that could influence to what degree legislators and parties and governments respond to voters. So I'm going to incorporate some more of the input in the chat here. Brittany says, I said market actors because I firmly believe that there is a strong correlation between the economy and politics. If large corporations or industries had enough fluctuation, there would be movement in government. Oil, housing crash, health crisis now with the pandemic. Yeah, absolutely. And Brittany is pointing out that the housing crisis and the recession and the financial crisis shows that really the market depends on the state. The state has to bail out the market. And that moreover, some of these economic actors are so large that they're too big to fail, and that therefore the state's involvement is necessary. And so to a certain extent, the state and the government and parties are structurally sort of compelled to serve the interests of business actors and market actors. This is a line of argument that's very consistent with what's called the Marxist structuralist theory of the state, which basically says that the state is a capitalist state because the market and the capitalist economy depend on the state, and the state has to support and bail out the market and permit it to function and to continue to function. And then so in this way, government and state institutions are just sort of subservient to economic actors and to capital and to economic processes. So this is a line of reasoning that suggests that, well, maybe voters don't matter a great deal. That's one perspective. Now, obviously, in democratic politics, they have to matter at least in some way, right? After all, even if market actors are primarily the source of funds for these parties, those parties are still obtaining that financing so that they can campaign more effectively to win the votes of certain voters. Now, granted, as we can see right now, there are very aggressive efforts by the Republican Party at the state level to reduce the vote and to prevent people from voting because they can't win elections. But that's a separate issue. Certainly it is relevant, but we're talking about the simple fact that parties need financing to campaign effectively to win votes, in that oftentimes to get financing, they've got to pass policies and at least in some way, relatively hospitably accommodate the interests of business actors. Let's just put it that way, to put it nicely. Aiden says, the reason why I chose market actors is because you do not bite the hand that feeds you if you are getting donated hundreds of thousands from businesses and lobbyists. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, without a doubt. And look, there's something else another concept that's useful here. Remember that concept, clientelistic exchange, clientelistic relationships? It's very much a clientelistic exchange if a politician or party's continued survival and success campaigning depends on currying favor with particular business interests upon whom they have become dependent for campaign financing. That is a clientelistic relationship, without a doubt. And make no mistake, those exchanges take place. And even if there's not a quote unquote quid pro quo, it's understood that the money keeps flowing if and only if the policies keep passing. And so that's a crucial part of this that we have to acknowledge and just be realistic about. Shandon says, I chose public opinion. And just as Ishan said, I believe that public opinion weighs heavily on what the policy will lean more towards, especially if a policy is well supported by a majority. Okay. So the context for this is really this larger debate about representation and party responsiveness. And it really goes back to one of the most definitive statements in political science, and that is the concept of representation by Hannah Pitkin. And this is a legendary book because Pitkin identifies all of these different types of representation, descriptive and symbolic and so on. And they all have different characteristics. They all function differently, but they all work in a similar way to connect voters to the system. And really the key idea is that representation is essential to democracy because democracy has to do with voters choosing leaders who will respond to them, either based upon descriptive or symbolic or any number of dimensions of representation that she identifies. And so the whole argument is about how the quality of democracy depends on the quality of representation. Better representation means better democracy. You get a closer fit between the interests and the preferences of voters and the policies and the agendas of parties. You get a better democratic outcome. You get more participation, you get more satisfaction with democracy, you get higher levels of voter affect or sense of voter dignity. And in general, you get a closer attachment to democratic institutions through parties. And so it's a very just wonderful story about representation and democracy. It's a conceptual story. And so it's very, very, almost philosophical. But there's one question it doesn't address. And the question hangs over the book, just sort of like like a pall. And the question is, do parties actually represent voters? Is there actually such a thing as representation, at least in the sense that Pitkin understands it, where voters express preferences and politicians and parties write them down and get to work writing bills and passing legislation. So I was taking a look at some Pew results, and I wanted to see what proportion of respondents would be confident that their legislator or representative would respond to them substantively if they expressed an interest or a preference or a need. Fewer than 1 in 10 respondents believed that a representative would respond substantively to their need. I was actually amazed that it was as high as 1 in 10 because, well, I may be a cynic, but really? Look around you. 1 in 10 people believes that a representative would respond substantively and maybe take up legislation in response to a need or a concern. It could be. There are examples. Usually the way we learn about those examples is because the politicians themselves have a PR event so that they can tell everyone about what they did. But that's precisely the point. It's an exception, it's not the rule. Parties are responsive, but who they're responding to is a separate question. Representation exists. It's just, who are we representing? Who's being represented? Representation always implies that there are two sides, right? There's the sort of elector and then the elected. But what happens if the elector is less influential than some other actor? Just a question, just a provocation. We have to ask questions about whether democratic institutions and parties function in the way that theory expects them to. This is what we're here to do. And so this is what we're doing in this case. And here in the United States, we have a special opportunity to assess the fit between the preferences and the interests of voters in the activities and the policies and the agendas of parties. Because, well, there's an important debate about the quality of representation here, as there should be. And there's an important question about who is represented and who is the sort of object of representation, so to speak. Or maybe it would be the subject. I'm not sure. Anyway, let's watch a video that is pretty interesting because it brings into focus both what people think is the norm regarding government responsiveness to citizen preferences, and then what is the reality. And there is quite a gap, and there's a lot of discussion here about the system and what sorts of incentives and rewards exist for politicians to represent actors different than citizens and voters. And so we'll really deal with this in a moment, but I just want us to just kind of step back and watch this and engage in a healthy and a careful criticism and scrutiny of the system, and to think about the question of representation and think about the quality and the functioning of parties and democratic institutions, and think about whether parties at the end of the day appear to be behaving in a way that democratic theory expects them to behave. This is really the key question for us.
For the last few years, I've had this sense that everything I learned as a kid about how America's government works is completely wrong. But I had no idea how bad things actually were until I saw this one graph. Researchers at Princeton University looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a pretty simple question. Does the government represent the people? Now, this is what they found. This axis here represents public support for any given idea. On the left at 0% are ideas that not a single American wants. On the right at 100% are ideas that everyone supports. This axis represents the likelihood of Congress passing a law that reflects any of these ideas, from a 0 to a 100% chance. On this graph, an ideal republic would look like this. If 50% of the public supports an idea, there's a 50% chance of it becoming law. If 80% of us support something, there's an 80% chance. You get the idea. Now, most Americans would probably agree that, with a few exceptions, we should be as close to this ideal as possible. Unfortunately, the way America actually works doesn't even come close. Take an idea that nobody supports, literally nobody, and it has about a 30% chance of becoming federal law. Now, take an incredibly popular idea, the most popular idea this country has ever seen, and there's also about a 30% chance of it becoming law. This means that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law. Put another way, and I'm just going to quote the Princeton study directly here, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. So if you've ever felt like your opinion doesn't matter and that the government doesn't really care what you think, well, you're right. But there's a catch. This flat line only accounts for the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, people who can afford lobbyists, they get their own line. Look at how much closer their line is to the ideal. When they want something, the government is much more likely to do it. And when they don't, they have the power to completely block it from happening, no matter how much the rest of the country supports it. They get what they want, and guess who ends up paying for it? We pay for it with the most expensive healthcare in the world. We pay for it with a tax code that's a complete mess. We pay for it with internet that's slower and more expensive, with wasteful spending, a floundering education system, a catastrophic drug war, and 1 in 5 American children born into poverty. Almost every major issue we face as a nation can be traced back to this graph. How does this happen? Well, just follow the money. Right now, it's perfectly legal to buy political influence in America. Here's how it works. Let's say a big bank wants a law that would force taxpayers to bail them out again if they repeat the exact same reckless behavior that crashed the global economy in 2008. Not exactly the most popular idea with the public, and Congress knows that. That should be the end of it. But that's where the money comes in. It's perfectly legal for our bank to hire a team of lobbyists whose entire job is to make sure that the government gives the bank what it wants. Then those lobbyists can track down members of Congress who regulate banks and help raise a ton of money for their re-election campaigns. It's perfectly legal for those lobbyists to offer those same politicians million-dollar jobs at their lobbying firm. Then those lobbyists can literally write the language of this new bailout law themselves and hand it off to the politician they just buttered up with campaign money and lucrative job offers. And it's perfectly legal for those politicians to take the lobbyist written language and sneak it through Congress at the last second. So now you've got a law that greatly benefits the banks, and the whole process can start over. This is how a bill becomes a law. A special interest hires some lobbyists. Those lobbyists collect campaign contributions, offer jobs, and then write the laws that Congress then passes to help those same special interests. This happens every day on every single issue with politicians of both parties. In the last 5 years alone, the 200 most politically active companies in the United States spent $5.8 billion influencing your government. Those same companies got $4.4 trillion in taxpayer support. And that's trillion, with a T. And that's just the top 200 companies. Never mind every other special interest, every union, every trade association, and every billionaire. Every single one of them can use their money to buy political influence. You know, there's this idea out there that this only became a problem after the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010. But the data goes back almost 40 years, and the results are clear. Corruption is legal in America. And as long as it is, anyone who can spend money to buy political influence will. The solution here isn't rocket science. Make corruption illegal. We already know Congress won't do it. I mean, one look at this chart will tell you that. What we need is a plan that lets us go around Congress and do what the American people do best. Fix this mess ourselves. Well, good news. We have that plan and it's already working. Now that we've got the problem covered, let us show you how to be part of the solution.
So I want to do an activity where we identify. What we're going to do is we're going to work together to identify issues or policies or ideas that like a huge majority of citizens want, but that have no chance of passing or that don't appear to be anywhere close to succeeding. So the question is, what are some examples of popular policy ideas that have no chance of passing? And let's just get started. We can name as many as we want. Chandon points out Medicare for all. It breaks my heart that that is probably the case, but at this point, it doesn't seem likely. It may in the future, but for now, we can put that there. In a second, we'll address some of the specific reasons or maybe why parties aren't picking up the public support for these ideas and running with it, because some of this stuff seems like a no-brainer, politically speaking, right? Very popular policies. That's the irony of this stuff. Ishan says federal background checks for gun. I think that universal background checks for gun purchases. Brittany points out I don't want to call it free college for all because we definitely pay for it, but we definitely will call it that. How about this? College for all. That's good. College for all. Simran says carbon tax. That's a good example. Edna points out student loan forgiveness. Federal Edna says equal pay for equal work. Alondra says lower carbon emission, or Kevin says like an immigration bill. Yeah, totally. Absolutely. These are all really good ideas, and yeah, we definitely got that, Collins, but these are all really good ideas. And what you're noticing, Jacqueline says electric cars. Tax abatements are just like subsidies for. I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence, but I don't want to be obscure either. It just means like help that people get to buy electric cars. So what do you notice about these? Do you notice any pattern? Who?
Sorry, can I jump
Yeah,
in?
go ahead, Edna, please.
A lot of them seem to be like related to, basic human rights, like, gun control, preventing, mass shootings, like people getting paid for the same amount of work, immigration, like a big human rights issue, carbon emissions, like a climate issue. It seems to be things that we would consider like no brainers.
Yeah, so there's a lot of there's a lot of really important substance there. This stuff seems like a no-brainer to us, and in a lot of respects it is, because you look at other advanced countries and they have these policies in more and better policies even, but the United States doesn't. And it's not because the public and public opinion doesn't support these ideas. We saw in the video that there's significant public support for a lot of pretty basic ideas. And here in the class, there appears to also be a lot of agreement that these, for the most part, are, pretty unobjectionable, pretty milquetoast in terms of social advances or moderate economic reforms, basic protections of the climate, dignity for humans, human security, a basic economic modicum or standard for people. But these things, despite the support that they enjoy among voters and ordinary people like ourselves, may be objectionable to those who are capable of self-providing and who don't want to potentially pay slightly higher taxes or even their fair share of taxes if it means financing some of these programs. And this is where we begin to get into the question of distributive politics and questions about trade-offs between spending priorities. And in particular, the elephant in the room that doesn't enter this conversation is spending on defense and the military. And in particular, the billions spent on planes that don't fly, investments that don't generate any return or amount to anything. While basic priorities go underfunded or aren't funded at all. I still remember during the previous administration, the Trump administration, when they totally defunded Meals on Wheels. And it was just so brazen and outrageous to me. It's like, this is an extremely effective program that takes food that's already available and in abundance in need of being used and then sends it to old people who can't feed themselves. That seems like a winner. And considering that it's already using resources that need to be used, getting rid of the program made no sense. But it was maybe a political choice as much as it was a choice that had to do with whatever spending priorities that administration had. But these ideas, these basic ideas, go underfunded, and they go not just underfunded, but they don't get advanced. So who is it then who's calling the shots, and who are parties responding to if everyone in society, or at least ordinary people for the most part, want these things, but we aren't getting them? Because here's the thing. This should be a no-brainer politically, right? If it's really about political support and responding meaningfully and substantively to the people who will vote you into office and shape your survival and your fate, shouldn't politicians and parties be knocking down the doors to pass these programs and these bills that have high support among voters of both parties? So what's going on? What is it that's missing? Why isn't there a sufficient electoral motivation for parties to push through these priorities? Can anyone shed light on us on that for us? Because presumably those voters would go to the polls and vote for politicians and parties who improve their welfare by passing these policies that everyone wants, right? So why aren't we getting them? Who's blocking them?
Well, I'm just gonna take on a couple of the ones listed here. Well, the creation of private prisons has created an incentive for people to gain money off the incarceration of people. And a significant portion of those people are arrested for drug crimes. So there's no incentive for those people to hire lobbyists that would support criminal justice reform because it would lose the money.
That's a really good example. I don't think decarceration or de-incarceration is a word, but pretend like you didn't see that. I'm glad that you gave that example. Criminal justice reform is another thing that people agree on. People of both parties, large majorities, agree that the United States imprisons way too many people for very petty offenses that amount to enormous costs for the state and that don't generate any substantive benefit in terms of rehabilitating the criminal or the person who's put in jail and called a criminal. And then the question becomes, well, why then haven't we pushed through criminal justice reform if it's so politically popular and would be such a winner potentially electorally, or at least would curry so much favor with voters? Well, one possibility is that the existing system, which relies on contracting with private prison systems, has generated large vested interests in the existing system. And those vested interests have the deep pockets necessary to bankroll politicians and to make sure that they influence the agenda and they prevent reform, because it would be very, very detrimental to them to change course. And so they prevent that from happening by very, 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 very liberally supporting particular candidates. And they do that through PACs and through lobbyists and through all sorts of sophisticated mechanisms that are designed to permit these interests to express their voice and to use their speech to influence decision makers. So that's certainly a good example. And I can think of many other examples that would seem to duplicate that pattern. And for instance, I'm sure that many of you may be thinking, well, that kind of sounds like healthcare, doesn't it? Some of the biggest opponents of healthcare reform and Medicare for all are the private healthcare companies, who are the core beneficiaries of the existing system. And so it's very likely that the political behavior of parties and governments is influenced and shaped by the enormous campaign contributions that private healthcare companies and insurance companies make to their campaigns, and through very particular mechanisms and means of lobbying and other ways of supporting them materially in ways that you and I can't, beyond $20 or $30 from your dog, or something to Bernie Sanders. And who wouldn't do that? But these are all examples that you might be thinking of. And the general point that I wanted to get to today and introduce before Friday is that parties have a variety of motivations, especially depending upon the institutional circumstances. In a place where campaign financing is private and where the laws are extraordinarily loose and there's a lot of dark money and there are many sophisticated mechanisms for transferring campaign finances to campaigns, well, there are going to be a variety of motivations that shape and influence politicians and parties, their behavior in power and during the campaign. And so we'll talk more about policies and preferences and responsiveness in parties and voters on Friday, where we get more into the global economy and business cycle and economic signals and stuff like that. But this is a good place for us to call it quits for today. We're off to a good start. See you again on Friday. Have a good one.